Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Methods Summit on innovation. Had a little change in the music there. It seemed like we started out kind of head banging and then went to classical. But hope you all had a good break and are ready to come back and take our discussions around innovation and perspectives around innovation forward. And in this panel, we'd like to hear from some folks who have thought about health technology assessment and how health technology assessment does or does not capture the value of innovation, and are there ways that we can make sure that the ways we're capturing it align with the different perspectives that we heard a little about this morning. So we've got a panel assembled to discuss these issues today. I'll introduce them really quickly. Lou Garrison is Professor Emeritus at the Choice Institute at the University of Washington. John Campbell is Senior Vice President for Health Economics at the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, or ICER. Randy Burkholder, I don't see on yet, so hopefully he will join us. He is the Vice President of Policy and Research at the Pharmaceutical and Research and Manufacturers of America, or PhRMA. And David Ridley is joining us. He's a professor at the Duke University Fuqua School of Business. So if Randy joins us, we'll have him come in the middle of the discussion. But just wanted to start first. Thank you all for being here. Just wanted to start first with really a question around what's your current understanding of what we mean by innovation? And you've heard, the different perspectives from different stakeholders and different lenses that they use to look through, look at innovation. But, do you hear commonalities there? Are there differences from the way we think about innovation in health technology assessment? Are those differences surmountable, or are we really just talking about different things and talking at cross purposes? And I guess I'll start with you, Lou.
Did you say me? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, first, I want to really congratulate IVI to Jason, Jen, and you for bringing this forum together. It's really been focusing on innovation. We've talked a lot about value. Now we're linking the value to the innovation. So I think that's a great discussion. And this morning's panels were terrific. Really brought out a lot of issues. I will come with the economist perspective. I only heard the term dynamic efficiency one time from Josh Krieger, so I start on that page, okay? And not just dynamic efficiency for the United States. I think about dynamic efficiency for the world, global dynamic efficiency. And there was one comment that, we would like to see life expectancy of everyone in the world improved, and I think that's where we're coming from. Now, as a health economist, I've struggled a bit with how do we define this. It's not that easy to look in a textbook and say, what is innovation? And, there was a time when I thought, well, we think, as economists, you think about production functions and, okay, I can have inputs. Now I get more outputs. That's innovative. That's innovation. But that's kind of the framework. And so I used to kind of think, well, in our field, if you can give me more length of life and more quality of life, that's innovative, right? Or save me money. So if you can, give me more qualities or save or have more cost offset, that's innovative. And I don't necessarily care about how wonderful the underlying biology or science is. I don't necessarily care about that. Yet, some value frameworks, like the one that was coming out of Sloan Kettering, had a little dial in there, a little button for scientific novelty, or the French ASMR system has people take a look at it like Nobel Prize, maybe a Nobel Prize is not awarded for lives saved, it's awarded for some scientific novelty. So scientific novelty matters. So when we were working on the value flower, probably starting 5 or 7 years ago, we certainly had the quality gain and cost offsets as prominent pedals. But I think we eventually brought in scientific spillovers. At least to my mind, I came to realize that concepts like pegylation or adeno-associated viruses they move across disease areas. So they're not just, and the idea, so we're not taking account of the systemic effects. And then, I've done some work with Richard Shea and Adrian Towles, supported by IVI. And we looked at papers like Josh Krieger's work on the more system level things, like we're a learning system, there are knowledge externalities. And so, everybody learns from other people's successes and failures. Now, maybe they learned to go after too many statins, but at the same time, we would all agree one statin wasn't optimal. We needed more than one statin. The question is, did we need 10? But we certainly needed, didn't really hit the sweet spot until we got out to 4 or 5. So there is a question there around that. But anyway, so I think we have to worry about if we just pay for qualities and cost offsets and under the current system and we don't just do that, honestly. Our system is, in our system, it's much more complicated. The correlation between value as we would measure it and what we pay is not that high. There are lots of exceptions and things like that. But at least in the framework that ICER is trying to use is trying to promote some consistency across disease areas. And our field sort of endorses that, but we can't forget that there are these broader externalities. And so if we only pay for qualities or cost offsets, we may not be putting enough money into the research and development pot. So I'll stop there, but that hopefully gives kind of a definition of innovation, a more concrete definition than we've heard to this point, but yeah.
Thanks, Lou. And John, since he mentioned the ICER framework, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, how does that framework think about innovation and define it? And are there places where maybe it's not capturing everything that other people may mean when they think about innovation?
Yeah, thanks, Rick, and thanks to IVI for running this great session today and follow-up conversations from it too. So excited about all those. Well, just to sort of build on what Lou was saying, if you don't mind, Rick, I've got about a 3-minute interlude. I'll try to be very brief, but basically my simplistic definition of innovation is something that is new and improved, with emphasis on the and. So take iPhone 14, it's new, but is it improved compared to the iPhone 13? We had the original iPhone, which was both new and made major improvements over prior less smart phones. So turning to pharmaceuticals and other medical interventions, innovation continues to mean new and improved. What type of improvements are most important? The things that ICER focuses on and that I feel are the most important are namely health improvements for patients and populations, as well as cost savings for patients and populations. So I'll stop there, Rick, but have more to say as we get towards solutions.
Thanks, John. Randy, I see you're here now with us. Just wondered if you had any different thoughts around what we mean by innovation and how well we're currently capturing it with our definitions.
Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for letting me join today. I think all I would add from a little bit, don't worry, Lou, I won't repeat dynamic efficiency as the non-health economist, but I guess at a little bit of a higher level, I guess I'd offer that like defining innovation is about as easy as defining value in healthcare. So I think, which we've all been working on for a few years now, and would say we've made some progress, but we still have a ways to go there, and defining it in ways that it's really going to work in the context of the U.S. healthcare system. So I think when we talk about defining innovation, I think what we're talking about to some degree is valuing innovation. And I think so we need to acknowledge right up front that we do have our work cut out for us, that you can define it at a conceptual, abstract level in a pretty simple way, but getting down to a definition that is concrete and something practical and able to be put into action is a lot more difficult. So value is cost over quality. Great. What are we getting for our money? But we still seem to have real challenges in driving better value across the U.S. healthcare system. Innovation, same thing. I agree, John. It's a technological change that achieves a desired and hopefully improved outcome. But how do we getting beyond that to appropriately rewarding that is really challenging. As we think about defining innovation can be really challenging. So picking up on something I think you said, Lou, I think one could argue, I don't think I'm going to argue, but you could look to FDA as a benchmark for innovation, at least in regards to approval of new drugs and biologics, because the agency is looking at robust evidence to make a conclusion that the benefits of an innovation likely outweigh the risks. And that's, I would say, useful, but not a complete definition. But it does raise one important point, which is the tools that we have at our disposal to judge the value of innovation are only as good as the evidence base that we've got. But I would acknowledge that that FDA approval is incomplete as a standard. It's partly because not all interventions or services are regulated to the same degree, and so they come into use with varying degrees of evidence to begin with, and we need to acknowledge that. But also, I think regardless of whether it's a drug or it's another type of intervention, it's really hard to know the degree to which that intervention will represent true innovation or the degree of innovativeness until some point after it enters real world use. You know, John, some might have called a 1970s Ford Mustang innovative, but I don't, you know, we found out in real world use, maybe it wasn't so innovative after all. But so I think that a lot of those questions aren't going to get answered until sometime after initial introduction. So not only is a product safe or effective, but how does it compare to other treatment alternatives in real world use? Does it provide quality of life or societal benefits that aren't captured in a strict FDA review of clinical risks and benefits? Lou, I think you already alluded to some of that as well. And are those initial perceived benefits, do they actually hold out? Are they diminished or are they increased as we gather more research over time? I think how we recognize that innovation, but also how we interpret and handle that uncertainty in value upfront will be one of the key issues. I guess two things, I'll try to keep it short, but two other things I think are really important is, you know, Lou, I think you referenced Europe too, and I think Europe shows us that you can define innovation and still not support innovation. So there are some countries in Europe that have a formal definition of innovativeness as part of an HTA program, but we can also see how the R&D enterprise in the biopharmaceuticals anyway really has stagnated in Europe over the last couple of decades and lost major ground to US leadership. So I don't think it's just about a definition. It's about how you are going to reward it within a system that does include bringing best available evidence to bear when we can. But I do think that even if we can't reach agreement on a definition of innovation, that doesn't mean we shouldn't roll up our sleeves and do work to think about how we can better align value assessment with innovation. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Randy. We can't wait for the perfect definition. We need to get to work and try to encourage innovation, however we're defining it.
Yeah.
So David, I'll turn to you and see if you have any additional thoughts around how we define innovation, but also if you had any thoughts on something that's come up here, which is there's a lot of different lenses or perspectives we can have on innovation. So for example, FDA is looking for a very specific type of innovation, but it may miss a lot of things that patients or other communities feel are important to consider as innovative. And so I wonder if you had any thoughts on, how do we get to that more comprehensive view of innovation that brings in those different perspectives?
It's a great question and a really good panel. You've already got a bit of disagreement on the panel with, I think, Lou defining innovation more broadly, John defining it somewhat more narrowly, Randy pointing out that we could use FDA metrics or real world metrics. I do like the FDA metrics in the drug space, say defining it as a new drug or a higher bar, a new molecular entity, or perhaps a higher bar being granted priority review. But I take Randy's point that the FDA metrics are imperfect. I don't know whether Biktarvy should be considered an innovative product. It's a combination drug. FDA didn't give it priority review on its merits, and yet it's making about $10 billion a year or something close to that. Is that a real world indicator of the value of the drug, or are market returns potentially misleading? I'm not sure, but I like the fact that we brought forward a lot of different metrics here.
Great. Yeah, and I'll stick on that topic of metrics. I think in health technology assessment or value assessment, we're trying to use metrics that capture the value of drugs, including the value of the innovation. We do that traditionally through cost and measures like the quality or life years, which certainly capture certain aspects of innovation. We've heard about the cost savings, dynamic efficiency that can be captured through cost offsets. The innovation in terms of effectiveness for the individual patient is being captured perhaps through the clinical measures we're using, maybe not everything that's important to patients though. So are we doing a pretty good job in health technology assessment currently, or are we undervaluing innovation in some systematic way? And what are some metrics we could maybe be thinking about putting in there? I think it's already been mentioned, the value flower out of ISPOR and some of the additional value elements there that I think try to get at innovation like spillover effects. But should we be pulling those in? Are those ready to use? What are we missing if we're not pulling those in? And maybe I'll start with you, John.
Thanks, Rick. Good question, to think about here. So I guess my take is, and my working hypothesis is that the status quo in the US is too generous and likely too permeable to incentivize only the true innovative pharmaceutical interventions that are not only new, but improved. And, I think we can see this play out in terms of how the median net prices have changed over the last 15 years, prices at launch. 15 years ago, the annualized median net price at launch was $1,376 in today's dollars. And then we can go down sort of a thought process of what have we done since then? And we've done a lot of we've made great improvements for patients in many different ways. And there's a lot of excitement around the corner, including in innovations in cell and gene therapies and others. But do you think we've made 100-fold increase in health improvements and cost savings over those 15 years? So the theme for today's conversation is on innovation and opportunities to improve value assessment, how much it matters, whether spillover effects are adequately captured in today's HTA methods, for example. But that's really part of the questioning that we're addressing at ICER is, do we really think that we're missing 90% of health improvements or cost savings with our current methods? So the elephant in the room for me is not the missing elements of health improvements or cost savings, but rather the fact that the median annualized net price at launch in 2021 has increased by more than 100-fold in the last 15 years and is now above $150,000 per treated person at launch. So to incentivize innovative medical interventions akin to the original iPhone, we really have to do a lot of hard work in freeing up resources where we are currently paying too much for interventions that look or operate just like another iPhone X.
Thanks.
Can I reply super quick to that, Rick, just because I can't help myself? But, I guess just to respond on the level of the numbers, I think that's a fair question, but it's it would behoove me to point out that over the last 10 years, per capita spending on medicines has only increased by $56. So one could just as easily ask, have the health gains that we've achieved been worth a $56 per capita increase in spending? And a lot of that is because of the natural life cycle of drugs that isn't there in other elements of healthcare. So, but the point being, there are different ways to look at those numbers. I think both are fair.
Got it. David or Lou, any thoughts on that question?
Could I would just like to say, the main point that I wanted to make wasn't really about the numbers, but it was more about not rewarding things that are not innovative. So I think we can talk a lot about how to reward things that are innovative, and that's an important part of what we should be doing hard work in. But I think just as importantly, or in my personal opinion, more important, to be thinking about not rewarding things that are not innovative.
So we need to be more targeted in how we're measuring this and looking at it. Any additional thoughts on that?
I love listening to Lou, so I'm pausing for Lou.
I want to go after you this time, David.
Okay, that'd be great. So I'm a fan of Lou's work and we're of similar minds. I hope I'm going to say everything that Lou would have said and he won't need to talk, but we'll see.
Oh, you'll say it better than I would have, I'm sure. So
I doubt that. Don't bet on that. So I'm a fan of ICER and their work. I think health technology assessment is flawed, but I'm glad somebody's doing it and trying to make it better. Some things I worry a bit about are putting appropriately high value on a year of life. I think the British are really cheapskates. 20,000 to 30,000 pounds for a year of life seems really low to me, especially in a rich country like the US. The British aren't quite as rich as we are. I worry about whether we give sufficient value to drugs for rare diseases. I'd like for us to sort of overpay for rare diseases because they are a form of insurance. Insurance makes us whole. And when an awful rare event happens, well, that's what drugs for rare diseases do. I do worry a little bit about missing incremental innovation, like if this is sort of path dependent, if we need this to get to that, I worry a little bit about that. And I guess to Randy's point, I worry that we might not fully account for the fact that, yeah, the drug's expensive today, but in a few years, if it's a small molecule, it's going to be free. And so Randy talked about how these expensive drugs become generics, and over the long run, they're not so expensive. So Lou, I think I covered everything. I think we're done, right?
yeah, you did better than I did. Thank you. But let me go ahead and make a few comments, if you would, Rick. No, I'm still trying to reconcile John's statistic about the 100 times net price increase with Randy's valid point that, look, total spending hasn't gone up that much. And I can't actually reconcile that. Now, I expect prices to go up over time because of diminishing returns, I mean, the whole composition of the diseases we're addressing are different. They're rare diseases and so on. We're getting to these niche markets. So, and just by diminishing returns, so we're going to have to pay more to finance it once due to diminishing returns over time. And so I expect them to go up somewhat. At the same, but I didn't expect it to go up as much as John said they have. So I'm not quite sure how that works. But I'm still going back to dynamic efficiency, which is we're trying, this is Joe Newhouse 2004 says the whole system is trying to approximate a dynamically efficient system. And it's complicated. We have the FDA, and we heard from Greg about how perverse the incentives in the PBMs are, and you're like, well, wait a second, those guys are really important in the system. And Greg told us it's a mess. Okay, so how can any of this stuff line up if the PBMs have as perverse incentives as Greg said? So that gives me pause. And I'm not an expert on PBMs. I really don't want to have to think about that, but it's a mess, it sounds like from what he said. Anyway, so yeah, but I think I did put out a definition of innovation, which I think, we're trying to maximize welfare, general welfare, as Josh Krieger called it. Economists like to call it social welfare, societal welfare. And we say it's the well-being of people, and well-being is affected by length of life and quality of life, and not just as patients, but as not, we're all patients, and we're all potential patients, but we're also taxpayers and premium payers. So all those things matter to us. So we have to take that broader perspective. And I think David makes a great point. We do have to think about things going off patent. I mean, the thing I wonder is, okay, we spend, and Randy would probably know the number, 100 billion, I don't know, 150 billion a year in R&D. So maybe $1 trillion over the last 10 years. And suppose the only thing we had gotten out of that was the mRNA vaccine through warp speed and saved trillions of dollars. And maybe it would have been worth it if we'd gotten nothing else out of the whole system. But I would point out that Cutler's paper basically said that 35% of between 1990 and 2015 or some number like that, 35% of the improvements in life expectancy could be related to pharmaceuticals. So I think it does have an impact. And so we have to take that into account.
Thanks, Lou. Yeah, and I wanted to come to something that came up in a question in the chat, which is, who decides what's innovative? And is that part of the issue we have right now is it's not just around how we're measuring it, but around what we're measuring. And are there things that, for example, patients may consider that are very innovative, but that don't come into the equation for payers because they're more focused on cost or other types of measures. And how can we try to bring in some of those patient important factors and make sure those are being considered? Things that may lead to better adherence or earlier treatment and that sort of thing. And I'll just open that up for anybody who has thoughts on that.
You know, I'm sorry, I got distracted by a very interesting question in the chat box. Someone said, I thought this meeting was about methodology. Okay, so we're letting somebody down. But I do want to point out, whenever I'm in these HTA discussions, I never know, we started out at ISPOR, pharmacoeconomics. And so we really do focus on medicines, but then we bring in vaccines and diagnostics and devices. But it's true that we probably automatically think of it because of NICE and ICER and all the agencies of the world, they tend to focus on medicines and how we pay doctors and public health and all that are they're done within a different health services research ecosystem of, okay, and I just slipped up and used the word ecosystem, which is the word I was going to point out. And it's a great term. We used to talk about the healthcare sector and the societal perspective. I've heard the word ecosystem at least 50 times at this point. And I think that's the right word because we got to think about the supply side, the demand side. And I think that's a good move, but I think we need to say, okay, we're doing ecosystem. So the question was about, well, public health has value too. And I agree, we all agree that that's, and we are kind of biased towards looking about rewarding this kind of margin, maybe the most innovative sector, which is pharmaceuticals. But there's innovation in doctors and hospitals and everything else too. But so we are kind of focused on that, and that's implicit. It's not that we don't recognize that the other things are important. And what we said, the methodology we have in health economics is this: we have 10,000 studies that in the Tufts database that have used the cost per quality. Now, recognizing the imperfections of the quality and some of the biases, people have done these studies 10,000 times. So people find them useful for decision making. So I mean, I would kind of rest on revealed preference there. So,
but I want to come to something you said though about the focus more on drugs, and I get why that happens. But is there a danger that by focusing more on drugs that we're missing innovation or not rewarding innovation that we should be in terms of public health, prevention, health system deliveries? Is that safe because we feel like that's got the right level of innovation?
Well, I mean, it's a very complicated question. I think, the whole, we have it's a market. We have a market for hospitals, a market for patients, a market for drugs. Drugs is the market where the price is endogenous, where we have to, we set the price at launch by the manufacturer. DRGs are regulated, physician fees are regulated. And I'm sure there's innovation going, there's innovation going on throughout the healthcare system, accountable care organizations, very dynamic, complicated innovation, and people are in a market that's happening. So people are reorganizing and all that's going on, but that's the market at work. It's not, we're not actually using the qualities don't work so well for that kind of innovation, because they're very system organizational things. So, and and they're being, the combat is in the market to see which models succeed.
Randy, you look like you were ready to jump in at one point.
At one point, I probably was, Rick. But no, I would agree with Lou, and I would say that you can look at that question on two levels. I'll try not to use the word ecosystem, Lou, but I think John, to get at your point about properly valuing what is true innovation, I think another way of talking about something like spillovers is to say that looking at any one drug in a vacuum risks undervaluing innovation because that drug hasn't come to improve patient lives in a vacuum. It comes out of that ecosystem where there have been a lot of failures and a lot of spillovers supporting that step forward. And so it's important when we're looking at the value of individual treatments to make sure we're valuing the ecosystem or the enterprise through which those forward steps occurred. So I think that's one level where there's a risk in looking too narrowly that we end up devaluing the ecosystem that gives rise to what is real progress. I think in terms of the health system as a whole, the methods challenges are different outside of biopharmaceutical and some of the other medical technology. You're absolutely right about that. Lou, I think there's a risk that if we say, well, the methods challenges are different, so let's just focus on what we know, we end up putting all of the sign us up for evidence-based medicine and making sure that healthcare decisions are driven by best available evidence. We're all about that. We're a science-driven sector. We have to be about that. But if you're putting all the weight of the entire value and sustainability question on drugs, because that's where your methods work, then you're really looking under the lamppost. And there is real risk that you will do harm to a very innovative sector because you're putting all of that cost containment pressure on one sector in the system.
Yep, David.
Yeah, likewise. And I too want to acknowledge Danny's comment in the chat. And in my research, I tend to focus on pharma, but instead of focusing on malaria drugs, we could think about how to kill the mosquitoes that carry malaria. And actually the pesticides have done a lot to protect people from malaria, as much or more than the drugs probably. Maybe instead of worrying about COVID drugs, we could worry about air circulation. Maybe instead of worrying about diabetes drugs, we could try to figure out a way to help people to live healthier lives. That last part's hard. I know I shouldn't eat so much, but I've been snacking nonstop today. I don't know how to get me to change my behavior, but I certainly want to acknowledge Danny's comment about alternatives to drugs.
Yeah, it's very important, and it's something we try to do in our work. Look not just the pharmaceutical treatments, but the healthcare system more broadly. And I'm going to go back to the term ecosystem, because I think it's a very good term for this, because it's a system that has a lot of interconnections, a lot of feedback loops. And one of the things I'm hearing is that maybe we capture in our current methods around health technology or value assessment, capture fairly well some of the impacts on patients, but we're not necessarily capturing some of the impacts that go beyond patients. And so we've heard about spillover a couple of times. And for those who aren't familiar with the term, this is really the idea that a new treatment may have benefits not only for the patients who get that drug, but for other patients who maybe it's a new mechanism of action that then gets used in different therapy areas. Maybe it's something innovative that people haven't thought about using in a different way, but then it goes on to get that. So there's benefits that go to broader society. Insurance value is one of the things we also hear in terms of that. But should we be trying to pull in some of those types of measures? Are those measures ready to go? Do we need to do more work on those? Even if they're imperfect, would they still give us information that would be useful to decision makers? Maybe Luke, since you are associated with the value of flower, I'll put that to you. You're on mute right now. You're still on mute.
And I mentioned the 10,000 studies in the Tufts. They're not, a minority of them are medicines. So that tells me health services researchers are using this for all kinds of things. And so the thing is, once you have the price of the medicine and that's set, then I can ask the question, well, what is the optimal pathway for patients? How do I do guidelines? How do I advise my patient and share decision making? So once I have all that, then I can do the benefit as the patient's agent or as the advisor to the guidelines committee. Then I can do an analysis and do a cost of benefit analysis, essentially comparing prices and at least cost effectiveness. So it's not just, these studies are being done for other things, besides medicines. Now, the challenge I have, and that maybe this is, okay, so let's say that we're going to, when ICER evaluates new medicines or NICE or people in our field in general, we look to, are we reducing mortality? Are we reducing morbidity? Are we saving money? And that's kind of what we look at. But then you come to the COVID vaccines and you realize that we have all these, this is another use of the word spillovers, but we have all these general equilibrium effects to other markets. So because of COVID, we kept our kids out of school. So we affected their human capital development. So we think that their lifetime earnings are going to be lower, okay? Now, okay, so Moderna and Pfizer helped to get our kids back to school, and other companies, all they had, but if I just pay them for the quality gains and the people who might be affected, am I putting enough money in the R&D pot? And so there's where we have to turn to the issue of what we call the elasticity of innovation. What is what happens to, if we cut back through the Inflation Reduction Act, total spending on medicines by so many, I don't know what the number is, $40 billion, some big number. How many fewer compounds are we going to have? And what are going to be the health effects of having fewer compounds? I mean, it's hard to argue we won't have fewer. Some people would say, well, we're going to have fewer, but not that many fewer. Other people say, well, it's going to be a lot and it's going to have big health effects. But, we have to think about, we have to also turn the discussion, and this is part of the dynamic efficiency discussion, to the responsiveness of innovation to these incentives. And we have to try to, we don't do a good job of knowing what that is. And I was involved in a study last summer and tried to get a consensus among economists, which turned out to be impossible. There was just a totally diversity of really top-notch economists could not agree on the responsiveness of that. So that means we this was at Office of Health Economics, and our bottom line was there's tremendous uncertainty about what the effects of reducing these revenues. So you better be cautious about what you do, because there could be your unintended effects. But I would say, as we've heard, we have an incredibly complex ecosystem with PBMs, with all the different players. It's just incredibly complicated. And I think, Jen Madsen had great comments on, working with Medicare, Medicaid, the market, and trying to take that perspective. And she mentioned, I think we were all optimistic back in 2010 when we started started PCORI, because we saw there's a tremendous market failure. The market doesn't produce real world data. I mean, why should any company bear all the cost of that? It's a societal benefit. So we really need to put billions of dollars, not just hundreds of millions or multiple billions, into collecting real world data. And we can't necessarily do it, I think, just by saying that, we need to do larger divert trials that are more diverse, because those are going to be cost prohibitive. And I think that's what, I'm forgetting the name of our venture capital guy, who's very helpful, was, he was kind of saying, well, we got to be a little pragmatic here. These trials are going to cost a lot if we try to do that. And, it's going to disincentivize R&D if it costs a lot more to get through the FDA process.
Yeah, you touched on a question that I had too when we talk about an ecosystem and how interconnected everything is how fragile is that ecosystem? Are we near a tipping point? And if we make, relatively small changes, is that going to tip us into an environment where we don't want to be, where there's not a lot of innovation happening? And it sounds like economists are divided on this the same way we hear about it in the general media, that there's divisions there.
I don't know,
I think
Randy, I put Randy on the spot. Randy, do you want to stay away from that or not?
Oh, no, but I'm talking too much.
Or have two arms, right? Okay.
I think we are dangerously close to a tipping point in how we think about the fragility of the R&D enterprise. And I'll probably use the word enterprise or ecosystem 5 more times, but and by that I mean it seems like there's a growing view that pretty aggressive policy changes can be made that impact the R&D ecosystem, at least on the biopharmaceutical side, but I think more broadly, without really harming our prospects for the advances that are going to come through a strong private sector R&D engine in the life sciences space. That isn't, you can't flip a switch and replace that with more federal funding, for example, or you can't significantly reduce incentives for that type of advance in the market and not expect it to affect development of future treatments. I mean, you all can speak to it better than I can, but early stage investors will go where there are the lowest risks and highest opportunities for return, and policy change can really influence that. And I think one of the things we're already hearing from some of our member companies is that the Inflation Reduction Act and its price setting provisions in particular already are having that kind of an impact. So are we at a tipping point? I don't know if we're at a tipping point, but we're not on a good trajectory right now, I would say.
David, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, just a thought about a tipping point, just an N of one. one investor told me about his tipping point. So he invested in a couple of companies working on antiparasitics. And when the price of priority review vouchers was about 200 million, he invested in a couple, and one of those made it to market, another one failed. But now that priority review voucher prices have fallen to 100 million, he said he won't do it again. So that was a tip for one investor, just one investor. I hope there are others who will invest. But he said, given the risk, it was 50-50 chance of success on those two molecules he invested in before. Given the risk, given the costs, he wouldn't do it again at 100 million. So one thing I'm trying to figure out right now is how to get that reward back up to 200 million.
Interesting. I want to go back to something that Lou mentioned around PCORI and the hopes for that when it came in terms of additional evidence. But I think also people were hoping we'd get a lot more patient-centered evidence. And there's a question that we've gotten about an issue that people see with HTA methods is that they very often use measures like the EQ5D, which I think a lot of people think isn't responsive enough, isn't sensitive enough, or maybe doesn't capture a lot of what may be important to patients. And so wonder if there's any thoughts on, is the EQ5D fit for purpose? Is it doing what we need it to do? Are there other things we need to be bringing in? What's the future there? I know there's a new EQ5D measure, which is captures more dimensions, which is supposed to get a more holistic view of health and well-being. I don't think it's in widespread use yet, but any thoughts around those?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Again, I go back to, let's think about that we're trying to approximate a dynamically efficient system. We're not going to have a perfect system. We've inherited a lot of perversities in the system. We've got, we have a broken health insurance system. And I think that's, but let me say about the EQ5D, I also want to go off on some other point, but I'll forget it by the time I talk about this. But okay, EQ5D, okay, look, the FDA does not look at the EQ5D. They do a benefit harm analysis based on clinical endpoints and whatever, and often disease-specific instruments. The whole field of health services research have to develop, we're constantly trying to improve them. Some of them have legacy effects. They were invented by clinicians 30 years ago, but there's a whole robust area of trying to come up with disease-specific instruments. And I would argue, well, people look at those in that area. The FDA looks at that when they do the benefit harm. And if they say, well, the benefits outweigh the harms, there's a group of people for whom the benefits outweigh the harms, we should be on the market. Okay, now it's on the market. Okay, now we're arguing about how much money to give to the company. We know the marginal cost of making it once it's on the market small. We're trying to design the reward system for innovation. We got to remember that, So, okay, well, can we use the disease-specific? No, we can't, because diabetes is different than psoriasis. We can't compare disease-specific instruments across diseases. And I'm trying to set a level playing field between companies that make psoriasis drugs and those that make diabetes drugs. So what I say, okay, I'm going to use an approximation that the quality, it's going to be length of life and a rough measure of quality of life called the EQ5D. Now, I can always tinker with the EQ5D, but no one uses that. Other than maybe the British rigidly, the Germans reject the whole thing and they negotiate price. And they can, once you're negotiating price, you can bring in anything in your, in your gut you want to, that you can bring into. So, so yes, we do it. It's just used as a helpful tool to do the EQ5D. And in cases where it doesn't work, people add on bolt-on questions. But again, when it comes to the actual management of patients, there are not many people who are using the EQ5D for that. It's more to decide the relative reward of the diabetes drug versus the psoriasis drug. And so it's an approximation. It's the best one we have thus far, but at least it gives us some consistency across different products, and that's why ICER uses it in a sense. They're recommending prices across the rewards across different products, and they want to have a consistent metric. So
that's all true, and yet it's woefully inadequate. And the problem, Lou, is that at a population level, again, I agree with everything you said, but at a population level, then you're telling patients with a specific disease state that the outcome that might matter to them, like an ability to swallow, isn't captured in EQ5D, and so we're not valuing it. And so in essence, we're not fully valuing your health in our quote.
Well, no, I would just say we did put the product, the FDA would have taken that, that we put the product on the market. It's on the market. Now we're just arguing about how big a reward to give for one thing versus another. And Yes, the EQ, but the question is, yeah, I mean, but there are other decision makers here. You know, after it's on the market, there's the clinical guideline writers who can, in theory, take that into account. There's the shared decision making where the physician's working with the patient deciding access. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, it's complicated.
My 30 seconds would just be like, so we need to be really transparent, especially when we're getting down to the patient and consumer level about what we are and aren't capturing. But to your point of PCORI, yes, PCORI should be doing more here. This is a huge gap that PCORI is perfectly geared to fill, and I would love to see them doing more.
I see that Eleanor has a comment in the chat. Thank you, Eleanor. She doesn't like the EQ5D as a measure of quality of life. And I will just point out that, you know, Eleanor and others have worked in the area, what they call patient important outcomes rather than patient centered. And, you know, they bring out the point that in America, what really makes people's lives bad is our poor insurance system. We have tens of millions of people who are at risk of losing all of their assets because of health. You know, is that a greater problem than the not access to a medicine? It probably is, you know. So, and people are at risk of high copays and catastrophic. So, and I think that comes out in their research. So, yeah, we're making this argument about how much money to give Pfizer and Moderna for the vaccines and so on. But you know, we're not really addressing the other flaws in the system, you know, which are from the PBMs that Greg talked about, you know, to some of these other things in terms of doing what's right for patients.
John, did you still want to jump in, or?
I just wanted to mention, you know, I think read recently that CMS might be investing $1 billion to administer parts of their opportunity to negotiate on some legacy high spend products within Medicare. And, you know, if we think about that, you know, wouldn't it be nice if we also had that kind of money to invest in understanding real world evidence and putting that out in the public domain such that it can be useful? I think some of the things we've touched on in this session have included, you know, what are some of those dimensions of value that matter? And I think we need to understand to what percentage they matter, and not only in a one-off, but in a more standardized format such that they can actually flow into standardized value assessment. And that's going to include, you know, more work and more analyses with RWE, and it's not going to be done through one study. So yes, I think we do need a lot more federal support of this kind of work to move the field forward, and to really only to be paying appropriately for innovative products. We should be incentivizing. We need future innovation for this to continue.
That's a good point. So one comment that we got in the chat was around the disconnect between needing to look at what's important to patients and society and the way value assessment is often done, which is geared more towards payer perspectives and much more focused on that. Is there a way to find a balance in value assessment or health technology assessment, or do we need a different mechanism, maybe a broader process for how to get at some of these decisions?
Well, yeah, I would just say, I mean, the gold standard is, I mean, what you would really do as an economist, you'd say, I'm dropping this technology into the healthcare ecosystem. I'm going to trace the waves through the whole system, every sector, kids going back to school, the medical care sector, the impacts on the quality of life of other family members. And you would like to, and including what's called distributional cost effectiveness analysis. How does it affect access across different population segments? And in theory, that's what we should be doing for everything, right? But it's very expensive to do it. It's hard to do it. But then the question is, well, how does that tie into the pricing? Okay. Well, we know how we set prices for DRGs. It's a very pragmatic exercise. We look at costs from a few years ago and take average costs. The physician fee schedule was set up a certain way. So those are administered pricing systems that are adjusted over time. The one place we have free pricing is in pharmaceuticals, and it's arguably the most innovative sector. And so we use the free pricing to encourage innovation. But the whole thing is quite complicated. And as I think Randy said, or someone said, you know, it's not just the launch price that matters. It's the size of the reward you give the company over the product lifetime that influences the investment. So you have to think about, you know, what Peter Kolczynski calls our contractual genericization. Hatch-Waxman is a contract with society that eventually they'll go off patent and we'll get them at marginal cost. And so the gains will go to society. Now, companies have every incentive to game the system to extend that period of patent protection as long as they can. And they certainly try to do that. But that's one of the things we need to work on. But that influences the size of the reward and the incentive for R&D.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to touch on too, we heard in the earlier panels a lot about digital technologies. And so I wonder if there are any thoughts about, do we need to, in two directions, do we need to do anything different in terms of how we evaluate digital technologies? And are there aspects of innovation that maybe our traditional ways of looking at drugs are maybe not going to capture? And we also heard a lot about this sort of passive data capture, that we're now getting streams of data on people that are coming in that could have a lot of information that could provide us, data around the value of some of these types of technologies, or adjacent technologies that aren't necessarily even related to that digital technology. But are there things we need to be doing different there, or is it just let's take the methods we've got now and apply them there and make sure that we're doing that in a rigorous way?
I'm willing to respond, but I've already talked too much. So, okay, but let me start real fast. Okay, go ahead, John. You go ahead.
Oh, well, just to share briefly. I mean, we've done some discussions internally on digital technologies, and one of the things that is different is the ability to hold on to that patent in pharmaceuticals for a period of time. And we worry that in digital technologies that competition might sneak in various ways that maybe, so it's just easier to compete in that space. And wondering then if the kinds of methods that we have in value assessment really translate fully over. I sense there's going to have to be some adjustments and some modifications to the way that we think about that prize in digital technology versus a patent protected product.
Yeah, and I guess to some extent, do you think if there is really competition and the market's working, you don't necessarily need value assessment because the market will figure out the value.
We hope that that's the case, but of course, if it's an insured product, then there's some sort of pooling of risk, and so that the market may not exactly play out the way you'd like it to.
Yeah, I think John makes a great point. It is, the value assessment method is the same. The question is the pricing, because the patent protection doesn't mean the same thing, just like it does, the same problem we have with personalized medicine. What was the incentive for the diagnostic that identified the subset of patients? It's hard for the diagnostic, unless we pay more for diagnostics, we didn't get them. So how do we get the, how do we gauge the rewards to and we have to do it with intellectual property protection. And if it's very easy for others to come in and compete with you, we may not get the optimal level. So and I would just like to introduce from the general health economics literature and Alvin Roth, the term market design. I think we need to start using the term market design and think about how this is a market. How do we design it? It's a global market. We should have global differential pricing. So let's start talking about market design and recognizing that these submarkets, we have a design here. Our design is, what we've been talking about. We've never called it market design. We should start calling it that and thinking about market design.
Okay. So 2 minutes left. I'm going to open it up to let you all have a final short statement. I will, to tee it up, I'll throw out a question I didn't get to ask, which is kind of my favorite, which is, we heard earlier about qualitative data and whether that can be quantified or not. But I do think there are cases where there are things that just can't be quantified or not very easily. And so, how should we be thinking about when we're doing these quantitative types of methods? Should we be bringing that qualitative information in a more formal way? Is it okay to bring it into kind of loose deliberations, and are people, decision makers, really able to integrate those types of information? You can either answer that or just give your final thoughts. Maybe Lou's first.
Okay, I like to quote Cass Sunstein, from a paper I read 20 years ago, or that was written 20 years ago. I didn't read it until recently, but he basically said, we do cost benefit analysis because Kahneman and Tversky has taught us that we're very poor decision makers if we go with our guts. We have to do the math. We got to work it out, so, and I wonder if Tony Fauci actually had the estimate of the risk of children dying from COVID right, when he was making policy, but not his fault, but it's a complicated question. So, we have to do the math. I think that's, and we got to work it out, and yet it's going to end up in a deliberative process. And somebody in Washington, D.C. is going to have a meeting and make a decision and institute the Inflation Reduction Act, okay, regardless of our best calculations, but at least we put them out there.
John, any thoughts?
Yeah, we got to do the math, and yet I think as we're observing, we probably never will fully agree on what the best algorithm is, that there's only one and only one algorithm to solve all of this. And so having some flexibility and opportunity to have pieces that contextualize the story and that are important in those circumstances is just a part of where we probably live today and likely will be tomorrow.
Thanks. Randy, you get the last word.
All right, well, yeah, I guess I would say, building on what Lou said about managed markets, that I think a competitive market is best geared towards striking that balance, Rick, between making decisions based on what we do know, but leaving space for what we don't yet know. And so I think it's important for us to keep that in mind as we think about solutions.
Great. Well, I want to say thanks to all of our panelists, and thank you for the attendees who put questions and comments in the chat. We could have gone on, I think, much longer on all of these topics. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jen Bright, who will be moderating our next session. Thanks.
Thanks, Rick. I'm going to go ahead and ask my panel to join us. Thanks, everybody, for being with us today. I'm Jennifer Bright. I'm the Chief Strategy and Engagement Officer for IVI. One of the things I love about our Methods Summits is that they bring together some really awesome perspectives from across the whole healthcare sector and kind of get us all to think a little bit out of our own work stream, our daily work stream. So I think we've accomplished that objective today, and I'm pleased to introduce the following folks to help me wrap up and kind of synthesize what we've heard over the last couple of hours. And then I'll hand it back to Jason to tell us what comes next. So we're going to hear from a few folks. First from Tiffany Westridge Robertson, who's the CEO of AI Arthritis, which stands for the International Foundation for Autoimmune and Autoinflammatory Arthritis. I hope I got that correct, Tiffany. And then we're also going to hear from Jen Graff, who's the pharmacist and Director of Professional Affairs at the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy. And lastly, Harold Carter, also a pharmacist who's with Express Scripts, and Harold is also a member of the IVI Board of Directors. So let me welcome those folks on camera. Great to see all of you. So I think the first thing, what I wanted to do, because we have the shortest panel today, but I think the most fun because we get the last word. What's one or two things you heard today that really stuck out to you? Either an area of consensus that surprised you or an area of clear tension that we have to get over if we're going to move forward on how we value innovation. So Tiffany, let me start with you.
Sure. Now, I want to put a disclaimer that I have literally front and back like 10 pages of notes. So I'm going to do my best here. I think for me, the biggest aha moment that I think we can always take away too as an action is hearing all of their perspectives and the timelines and what people felt were valuable to them or the perspectives to them. I actually started drawing out a grid on each stakeholder group and then how they were saying things like, I have a simplistic view, AKA ICER. Then we have other groups that are saying, well, we have a long, or very broad overview. So just even those little basics of the overviews and the perspectives of what people are coming from. And then essentially those timelines. We started with the history of 5 years ago, we were not very far. The last 5 years, we've gotten pretty far. Then we were talking about a lot of overview for the future. And I think where we're going to go into in this discussion is really what we can do now. So my biggest aha moment was really that takeaway that we all sort of have one commonality in mind. Everyone's saying that we agree that the patient should be at the center, but the way we're all expressing what that value is to the patient is very different. And until we start to map those out and figure out the motivation behind innovation and frankly impeding it, will certainly help us move the needle a little bit towards coming together.
Thanks for that perspective. Jen Graff, what do you think about what Tiffany said? And do you have another aha to add to the pile?
Yeah, I had so many. And first of all, kudos to IVI. Looking back, I think I found that you're just shy of your 5-year mark is when your first press release for IVI came out. So when you think about where most organizations are and how you've advanced the dialogue in 5 years, having had a 5-year-old, man, that's a lot of work in those first 5 years. And so it's good to see some of this come together. I think one of my key takeaways that I had at the very beginning was that we've moved from recognition and now we're moving towards resolution. And I started thinking that applied throughout each of the sessions that I heard today, whether it was Walter talking about the patient perspective and that we need to better understand this so we can all do our jobs better. I thought that was really important. But what we still need is to really emphasize and underscore the need to elevate the patient voice evidence. So it's the same level. We have a lot of pharmacists on the call. We love data. And if we're going to make patient voice really stand out and stand on its own, it's going to have that same level of, or at least the level of rigor beyond anecdotal evidence or a single testimonial. And so I think that was my second key takeaway. Where I had on the third was innovation. We need to think about tying it to effectiveness, not just whether or not it's a new mechanism of action, a new formulation. We have some really cool way that we're redesigning cells and engineering genes for patients to have durable therapies. But if we think about the average person taking the typical medications, their challenges are getting the right treatment at the right time, the diagnosis, making it easier for them to adhere to it, making it easier for the physician to prescribe it. And so when we talk about innovation, I think there's still a lot more work that we need to do to describe, are we talking about innovation in terms of new molecular entities, or are we really talking about innovation that provides value to patients? And then my last 2 points that I would have is we're in open enrollment time for many of our families. I'm sure if you're part of the 155 million Americans who get your insurance through the employer sponsored insurance market, we have a hard time figuring out what's the right plan, what's the right insurance that we need. It gets so much harder when we actually talk about what's the right value for medication. And if I can't figure it out as an informed consumer, or at least I think I'm an informed consumer as a pharmacist and having worked in this space for years, I can only imagine what it looks like for others. So the more that we can do to ensure that when we're talking about value, that is pulled through the rest of the health system, that it's pulled through as I'm making my open enrollment decisions, as my father-in-law is looking at his Medicare Advantage zero premium dollar option, what does that actually mean for him? And we need to better pull that through. If we're going to do that, it's going to take a lot more of the types of individuals on today's call, because if we're launching about 50 new molecular entities every year on average, it's going to take a lot more of the people on this call to help inform what's the value of those treatments, not only compared to another treatment, but in the real world. And so I think where we really are landing is we're 5 years in, we're at the recognition, and we have a lot more work to do on the resolution.
Great point. Harold, welcome to the conversation.
Yeah, man, I got stuck behind really a good crowd. So, all right, we'll see. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So, you know, one of the things for just reflecting on some of the conversation is, again, I agree everything that Tiffany and Jennifer said. But when I think through it, it's making sure we don't get into this analysis paralysis. So the last conversation that folks are wrapping up was, well, what about this scenario? What about that scenario? What about like patent protection and all this other stuff, right? And what is the analysis that's associated with there? I do think, you know, in the market, as we talk about now, what's the action moving forward? I do think that, and this may be a little bit more optimistic, I do think the market is fine with us testing, failing, but failing fast and not keep like doing stuff that doesn't matter to move on to the next thing. And so just walking out of this, I think it's as we take the next steps, some of this is not going to work that we're working on, right? But fail fast and sort of move on to the next thing. The other item that I would say too is, how do we, as much as it was a good conversation, I agree with Jennifer around elevating to the patient, but not necessarily just what is their cost, but actually what's the ecosystem around them, right? So as we think about, a great example is Alzheimer's, right? A lot of those treatments are great, but there's so much infrastructure that needs to be supported around that patient that it's about the drug, but it's actually not really about the drug and the disease. It's everything that's around it. So I think we have to start thinking less about the drug or the treatment and what is the way that we support that patient around it so that they are successful. And then also, I'm a pharmacist and I love my clinical jargon, right? And I saw someone just said industry's jargon, right? Those are one and the same. Is you know, I've said this on other calls before. When we have to keep it simple. So I'll give you a great example. I was talking to my grandmother about something and for work, and she was just looking at me and said, "Oh, that's nice, that's nice." And it was just, she's like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." So when I pushed her further on it, and I think that sometimes when we walk into the system, we all get at this level that is so deep. Patients don't actually really care about that, at least from what I can tell. They're just like, "Hey, how do I get the treatment? How do you educate me on it? And what are my next steps?" And so I do think we've got to make sure that as we're looking through this, that we're simplifying it, because that is continuing to be, I think, a challenge in the marketplace. And I think payers struggle with it. I mean, health systems struggle with it, hospitals struggle with it, health plans struggle with it, PBMs do. And so there's got to be some way to simplify this messaging, because today we've made such little tweaks here and there, and it's so complex that you can't really kind of figure out how it all ties together. I mean, Jennifer, we actually just did get our benefits notification to enroll, and literally one part of my organization is a health plan, and I actually don't completely understand it all myself. And so, I mean, it's not an indictment on Cigna, right? But I think that's an indictment on us as an health system, that we've probably overcomplicated things at times.
Yeah, those are all great perspectives. I think something else, in addition to the aha moments you had, something I heard that was a common focus across all these wonderful panel discussions was that data seems to be a really linchpin issue. It is, I don't know whether it's the alpha or the omega here, but I wonder your thoughts about your reflections on that, the importance of getting the data, improving the data, and how far upstream do we have to go? I think that's one question. And the other is who? I think I hear a lot of hot football going on with who needs to be involved in fixing this data issue. But if it is the issue, then it needs attention. So what's your thoughts about, is that right? Did I hear that right? And second, who needs to be involved, and how fast can we fail fast? Let me pick on Jen, because I know this is Jen Graff, because I know this is a
I think it is such a hot topic. And you know, with today being the data blocking day where things are removed, I can't imagine that it wouldn't be every part of us. If we can figure out and work to design cars that run on electricity and figure out maps. We should be able to all work together, because if we understand those problems, we can handle that better. So I think that it's going to require every person that's around the table and the stakeholder organizations we interact with. What we're going to need to figure out, though, is what's the data provenance? How do we reward people? Because data collection and cleaning and mining and hosting, it's not, it is not just a $0 activity. It takes staff, it takes capacity, and you need to be rewarded if you're contributing to that. And then the last piece that we really need to do is to figure out, how do we address trust? And I know it came up in the earlier discussions, but as we talk about health disparities, there's so much distrust in the organization, or, in the system, about even sharing certain information. We need clearer and better standards or agreement on how that data can and should not be used, kind of like that better code of ethics.
Tiffany, any thoughts in addition to what Jen said?
Yes, that's almost exactly what I was thinking about. Just in general, the kind of the second aha moment, or really, I mean, it wasn't necessarily aha, I think we all knew it, but I think a big takeaway is this unified data point and the subgroup, and what we heard from many different stakeholders, a theme of we need to be able to measure the value of what patients care about most, and the key being here to measure it. So I think that, as Jen said, we need to have all of the stakeholders that have been here today at the table to come to some kind of consensus on what we can measure past clinical trials, what can be considered real world data, and then what would patients in those subgroups. I'm going to keep pushing on the subgroups, because we know there's a fatal flaw in a lot of these measurements when we're talking about generalized patient populations. We don't tick specific boxes, and I'm not talking about N of 1 either. I'm talking about very specific demographic subgroup issues, very specific atypical subgroup comorbidity issues. Those all need to be considered when we're talking about value assessments, but in what's going to become on a formulary. But only if we work as a team and say, hey, this patient group thinks that this is a priority, the other people on the other side have to be able to accept that as data, right? So that's why I say we need to work together and build on what was just said, because if we come up with our own, what we think is valuable points, and it doesn't go past anyone else, then we don't get the access, and we're right back to where we started.
Right. Harold, thoughts on data? How do we reward it? Who's responsible for paying for that laborious process?
Yeah, so it aligned with what everyone said, right? I think we all have some responsibility. And Jennifer kind of hit on this, when you think about when like a car is made, right? Like if you're at GM or Ford or Tesla or Honda or whatever, right? They don't actually make all the parts, right? They have to purchase those parts through subcontractors and things of that nature, or other companies, or the chip shortage in the US, right? So it's not that manufacturer that actually is creating all those parts. They're bringing it all together, and there's a subset of ways that we think about, like there's certain sort of guardrails that everyone has to live by, right? Whether it's safety, all that sort of stuff, and it comes together to create good cards that all kind of in shortage right now. But again, it requires sort of everyone to sort of play by a same sort of set standards that exist there to sort of create sort of that end product. And so to me, everyone plays an important part. There's got to be a baseline agreement on kind of what all the data needs to be valued as clear. We won't always come to the same conclusions, but I think that actually will weed out at least a lot of the nuances that we see between each other. And there's always going to be, right? There's always going to be a GM. There's always going to be a Ford. There's always going to be a Honda, right? There's always going to be different brands that are out there that look at something a little bit different. And that's okay, right? Because that's what drives our economy and our health system.
I love the car analogy. One could argue that in a car, you have an engineered design and the end product that you have a very clear visual of what it's supposed to look like, how it's supposed to function. But I think one thing that's come up today is that we don't necessarily all have the same picture of what our car, and by that, what does equitable health look like? And because of that, we're trying to reverse engineer it. And that's where it's getting messy. So that just my editorial comment.
The one thing I would say though, is keep in mind, there's always safety standards, regardless of how any of those cars are built, that are baseline before they build it out. So I
Great.
can't help myself, but
I love it.
I'll get
Let's
off now.
keep talking about analogies. You know, they're my favorite. We would be remiss if we didn't end this method summit with really thinking forward in terms of action. So in just our final few minutes, I'm going to ask each of you, what's an action that either where you sit in your space, your professional space, or another stakeholder where you're saying, where you think, I would like to see action happen in this area to help us better understand how to value innovation. Let me work in reverse. Harold, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
Yeah, so where I think for me, where I think it's important for us to see more understanding is, just personally speaking, is sometimes a lot of the endpoints are fairly subjective. Like having more clear endpoints that folks can sort of like understand, and I think can actually put something a little bit hard around is actually is going to be important. And the other thing I would say too is, in the marketplace, I think there probably needs to be a little bit more openness for all of us, right? To be accepting that we're probably going to have to fail fast and something's not going to work out. Be open to piloting stuff and realizing it's not working, so then you can exit off the list. So I think just broadly, there has to be some acceptance that we're not always going to get it right. But if we keep this analysis paralysis, we'll never sort of move the ball forward.
Great, thanks. Jen Graff.
This came up earlier during the conversation, but high value products should be rewarded. And conversely, if you reward high value products, that means that there needs to be disincentives for low value products. And it may not be that what is high value for all patients is, for some patients, is reflective of high value for all patients, and conversely the same for low value products. And so I think the more that we can better understand and say, yes, we aren't going to pay for those lower ROI activities for certain patients in patient groups or care settings, the more that we can have available in our system to reward that new innovation that is bringing that spillover, scientific spillover, the hope, all the other things in the value flower that we've been talking about. But we have to be okay with saying no.
Okay, Tiffany.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a more generalized approach, and I'm going to just call of action to people who attended the webinar who may be watching it afterwards, because we are a big collaborative group, right, with different perspectives and very valuable perspectives. Pardon the pun. Very valuable perspectives. But I'm going to go back to what I was talking about and how I was sketching this out is just a person observing, also participating, but listening to what everyone has to say. And I think anytime we're going to move a needle towards change, the first step is always to understand, which we've been doing today, everyone's perspectives, everyone's timelines, everyone's non-negotiables. So, and I liked what Harold said, I like the term guardrails. So what are these non-negotiables? If we're all going to have these viewpoints, where is our core fundamental values that we're not willing to budge from? Where are we coming from on that? Map those out in some type of table or grid form. And then all of us really try to fill out that form. Where is our perspective? Where do we define innovation? Where do we see potential to come together? Because once we map it out, I think that it will be a lot easier to come to agreement regarding appropriate ways to maybe capture measurements, inclusive of different subgroups, different groups, and essentially be able to find that value that will be considered as we get all the way, through implementation and access. So that's my call to action. Let's all continue to work together on this.
That's great. Well, everybody who knows IVI knows that we are heavily invested in what I like to call radical collaboration. So that has been one of our primary goals for today's Methods Summit, which I think we don't view this as the last part of the conversation, but as Tiffany just said, the beginning of understanding and finding common ground. So I want to thank all three of you for lending your ears and your ideas to helping me wrap this up. And I want to thank everybody who's been on the phone today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jason Spangler to close us out and tell us what comes next. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks, everybody. I think we're going to pull up one last slide here. Just waiting for that to come up. Like Tiffany said, I've been taking a ton of notes in my notebook, and I'm not going to give it justice by condensing or summarizing everything, but I did, before I go to kind of next steps and follow up, I did want to highlight 3 things that I heard, and there's more than 3, but these are the 3 that stood out to me, and we will continue to work forward with this. So one is that patients should be first, but we need to consider the needs of all the other stakeholders as well. And so I think that's definitely something we can agree on. Another is there are different definitions from the various stakeholders and those involved, but there's definitely overlap and synergies between those definitions. And so we need to consider that. And then the last thing that really stuck, throughout the panels, particularly the last few, were we need more data and data. And so that's something, that obviously not just us, but everyone probably on the phone and on the webinar are focusing on. And that's something obviously we will push moving forward. So those are kind of the 3 of the main things that stood out to me, with many other things as well. So as we move beyond the summit, just want to let everybody know that this was recorded. So this the recording of this entire summit and virtual session will be available on IVI's website soon. So look out for that. We will also be sending out shortly, hopefully in the next few weeks, a summary of the key themes. So we will share that with you also. We also wanted to let you know, as part of this project overall, there's going to be a call for papers in early 2023 on kind of key research themes that emerged from this work that we're doing. So for those of you who are looking to do more research in this area, just look out for that call for papers, because we want to expand the literature and the research base in this area. So be on the lookout for that. And then we just encourage you, we know there were a lot of members involved with this summit today. And if you're not a member, please look into IVI. As I said in the very beginning, we are a membership organization, and we'd love to partner with other organizations. So we'd love for you to get more involved in this and the other work that we're doing. So please look into that. And the last thing I will say is that, we have an annual reception right before our annual meeting. You probably saw a slide that our members only annual meeting, but we have an annual reception that is open to all on the late afternoon, early evening of October 17th. So you can find more information on our website. It'll be local, it'll be in person, which is great, but it'll be in Alexandria, Virginia. So hopefully we'll see a lot of the summit attendees at that reception. So thank you, everybody. I think there's also probably, is there another slide, or is this the last one? I just wanted to, again, kind of finish this by thanking all of our members and their contributions to the work, and the work that we do, and also thank, again, Pharma for the support that it provided for this summit. And then I will finish with one last thing. Everyone on the IVI team, thanks for coming. Everyone on the IVI team did wonderful work on this behind the scenes, a lot of the things that you didn't see, and it went off very smoothly, I thought. But I wanted to highlight a couple of people. Jen Bright and Tiffany Huth, who you both heard from today, did a great job putting all this together. And just thanks to Rick Chapman and Richard Z, who's overseeing this overall value innovation project for IVI. So I wanted to highlight those folks specifically, but thanks again to the whole team. And thank you for joining us today. And we hope to